La classe operaia accompagna l'attacco, Stato e padroni non la possono fermare, niente operai curvi più a lavorare, ma tutti uniti siamo pronti a lottare. Buon lavoro salariato, unità di tutti gli operai, il comunismo è il nostro programma, con il partito conquistiamo il potere.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Minor Compositions podcast. Today we are joined by Jacopo Galimberti to talk about your book, Images of Class, Operaismo, Autonomia, and the Visual Arts, 1962 to 1988. And it's really nice to have you come on the podcast, Jacopo. In some ways, it feels like the absolute perfect book to talk about on this podcast and for this sort of series. How familiar you are with minor compositions as a sort of book series or publication series?
Sorry, Steve.
So I'm asking sort of how familiar you are with minor compositions as a publication series.
I'm not familiar, unfortunately, with minor compositions.
That's okay. Well, the reason why I say you're the perfect guest is when I started it as a publication series, let's say I started formulating in 2006, it was based off of reading books like Nick Toburn's book, Deleuze, Marx, Politics, and he's talking about the idea of a minor composition, and this is where I started working with Bifo, and the initial hunch was there is this, or could be this overlap between aesthetics, the avant-garde, and Operaismo that was there, that I had a hunch was there, but I never actually sort of really looked into it in depth. And reading your book, I'm like, it's literally true. All those things that I thought might be true actually are true, or it's much more significant kind of overlaps there were between the arts and various strands of autonomism that I knew at first. So maybe as a way to get into the book, I suppose when I was reading it, there struck me as being two main kinds of overlaps, right? You have, let's say, overlap one would be the ways that operaisty ideas influence particular artists or art collectives, right? So what these ideas meant to artists and how it influenced their practices, right? And then a second approach might be sort of how roles that particular forms of art production or cultural production played in the development of Operaismo. So what arts did for Operaismo, right?
Yeah.
So just thinking of a way in, maybe we'll start with the idea of, could we say that there is an Operaisty approach to artistic production, or are there just lots of overlaps and conjunctions rather than any sort of, commonality?
I think it's very risky to say that there is something that we can call an operaista aesthetic. I don't think that such thing exists. Well, first of all, because Operaismo was such a diverse and heterogeneous movement, that also spanned different generations, different contexts, different decades. So basically, I don't think we can talk in terms of an operaist aesthetic. Nonetheless, you don't have something consistent and homogeneous, and yet you do have, in my view, some constant images, ideas, visual strategies that can be related, perhaps not only to Operaismo, but to a large extent to this kind of political theoretical framework. So I think, so a number of praxis, a number of ideas, a number of strategies in the visual arts can be connected with Operaismo. Yeah, I think so.
Maybe we can start with sort of a particular example. I mean, who would you say would be a particular artist or a particular practice you think that shares a lot or could exemplify that kind of conjunction? I mean, should we start with someone like, let's say, Balestrini?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Baruchello was also part of this movement in the 70s. It was part of Potere Operaio. It was close to Autonomia. So there was also a very distinctive biographical link. Others, perhaps less well-known artists, were also part of, for example, Potere Operaio. But I think, well, one example would be a visual strategy. I mean, I tried to kind of delineate what I called the strategy of exacerbation, which is basically a way to exacerbate visually and conceptually to create, let's say, dystopian views that have, of course, a critical edge that wants to views that want to tear the veil of the capitalist ideology. And I think this is quite distinctively related to Operaismo, insofar as these forms of criticism are not moralistic, are not do not depict a sort of compensatory utopia. They really try to kind of lay bare the real dynamics of the system. So, and this kind of visual strategy is shared by quite a few artists, I think, and I think it's a good example of something that emerged from Operaismo.
So what you get there is less a sort of depiction about some future or present utopia, and more about, let's say, an intensification of aesthetically of the kind of antagonism that already in movement.
Yeah, I think so. It's an idea. I mean, I guess the idea behind it is you should not depict struggles. You should not celebrate strikes. Well, you can do that, but the main issue here is the ideology of capitalism, and to make it visible, to make it understandable, and the struggles will find their ways to kind of they'll find their icons, they'll find their grassroots mottos, but I think the idea was to kind of lay bare the ideology of capitalism, but also of the institutional left, which from the perspective of Operaismo was the main provider of ideology, the main obstacle to class struggle.
And so I suppose that would be partially why you wouldn't want to fall into representation in a sense, because that would easily segue back into creating new forms of, let's call them like ideological traps or.
Yes, I think so. I think the main fear was to become decorators of struggles, or to kind of replicate a 1950s forms of realism. That often had a sort of, as I said, a rather compensatory function. Let's celebrate the workers. The problem was, according to Operaismo, was not to celebrate the workers, but to abolish the working class. And in order to visualize this process, you need to kind of depict the system that forces the working class to exist as such. So it was more about the mechanism, the dynamics, the paradoxes, the contradictions, and to make them look, to exacerbate them rather than to resolve them.
Well, I suppose that connects to one of the main ideas that comes up multiple times, is this idea from Tafuri, where he says that just as there is no political economy of class, only a class critique of political economy. Yes. Similarly, there is no aesthetics of class. There is no aesthetics of operaismo. Yes. There's only a class critique of aesthetics or of cultural production.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, again, this is something he wrote when he was influenced by Tronti and Azarosa and Pali Negri as well, Cacciari. It's a text he published in Contropiano. Very interesting journal that published texts about various forms of art, but also about strikes. It was a very kind of a very interesting combination of academics, activists, aesthetic, architecture, cinema as well. Very interesting journal. And Tafuri basically is trying to say, look, don't think that you can have a, don't entertain the illusion that art or architecture, which is even more political, more social, can change things, can induce or encourage forms of working class life or even struggles. This is, I guess, Tafuri is opposing a very common discourse that was widespread among architects at the time. So the idea that built shapes could induce behavior. And basically saying this is something, if you think like that, you underestimate the role of the economy, the role how like social housing are shaped not by architects but by policies, by the social institutions that rule these spaces economically. So the idea was to not to embrace a strictly cultural battle, but rather to look at the economic dynamics behind them. So policies rather than forms. Of course, both exist, but there was a tendency to look at architecture as a form of as a fine art, in a way, underestimating in Tafuri's view how politically determined architecture was, and urban planning, of course, as well. So class critique of architecture is a way to kind of look at the structures that rule architecture as a discipline, as a form of knowledge, and so on, and the architect as a figure, as an intellectual.
I suppose in some ways that's kind of similar moves to what people in the SI were doing in terms of making a critique of unitary urbanism and looking at architecture as sort of planned environments as a sort of outgrowth of the logic of capital, rather than thinking that you have a sort of a relative autonomy to architects that could shape structures in certain ways.
The difference, for example, if you look at those forms of utopian architecture that emerge from the SI, think of Constant or even Galician yawn to a certain extent. Well, although this is again something slightly different, but so the utopian vision, the non-utilitarian architecture so typical of the SI, is not present within Operaismo. So this utopian élan is absent, because it was seen as a form of, as a compensatory fantasy, I guess.
Well, I suppose in a way there's a similarity, because my understanding is this is basically why De Boer and Vaneghem try to like kick out Constant, and basically the people who are engaging what you might think of as more compensatory utopianism in design. It's like, no, we want to get rid of that. But
yeah, I think, yeah, and also Galicia as well, but not all of the artists were kicked out. For example, there was this Danish Martin, I think was called, I don't know how it was pronounced. So just to say that the actual dichotomy was not between militants and artists within the SI. which was often repeated, but I think it's a bit more complicated than that. But still, yeah, sure. The Spur, the German group, was also a big fan of utopian projects, and this was okay, but also at some point quite problematic because, again, what is the status? What is how are we supposed to understand these projects, these utopian visions? How do they, how can they contribute to, class struggle, proletarian emancipation, and so on? It's a quite tricky approach to, to an emancipatory vision of the future.
I think if interesting about that is if you get the idea that sort of, again, maybe I shouldn't generalize, but the sort of Operaismo doesn't like this compensatory utopianism in terms of aesthetics. There certainly is a very real sense of like certain kinds of style and aesthetic considerations being very important. I'm thinking about Tronti's line about like conflict awakening, they say, is sort of kind of a Nietzschean sense of style, right? Or the line he has where, and I think this is in a later interview where he says something like the people who were occupying the factory by day were reading Lukács's Form and Soul at night.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating aspect of Operaismo. And again, I mean, this is true. And the person he was thinking of was Sergio Bologna, who translated Soul and Form, I think, by Lukács into Italian, while he was a militant and an activist, also active in front of factories and so on. So I think there's a real example, but I think the main idea behind that line is high culture can be a tool if we know how to use it, if we appropriate some of its ideas, some of its contradictions. We should not fall back into the idea that in the 1950s PCI culture that ruled out bourgeois writers, bourgeois artists, in order to celebrate, a sort of working class culture, a pure, immaculate working class culture. So Operaismo did not like that. Wanted to depart from the essentialist vision of working class culture, because Operaismo says there's a new working class in the factories. So we need new ideas, new images.
And so that could also be part of a process of class composition, is understanding as emerging political compositions emerge onto the scene. So for instance, starting with, I guess, Southern Italian workers moving north and find new modes of expression and organizing, they would also find new modes of aesthetic cultural production in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually this is something I've never told you, Steve, but I also realized that Federici wrote a PhD on Lukács because I read it in your book, The Composition of Movements to Come, where you mention PhD on Lukács. And this is again, very interesting discovery, because an activist, not Bologna at this time, Federici, was, also a PhD student working on Lukács. So the two things, cannot be separated, I guess.
I found that super useful because it's interesting, because the way that I found that out, when I finished my PhD in 2009, and what I did then is I thought that the process of, in the UK, when you do a PhD exam, it's just like you and two examiners in a room, right? So like no one hears it. And to me, that felt a little bit like a bad idea. So I decided, maybe out of pure masochism, that I wanted to do a public event of it. So I organized a public event at 16 Beaver Street in New York with Sylvia and George, and had them basically to do a public sort of discussion of my PhD, which was nerve-wracking because I think I cared more about that than I cared about the actual exam, And Sylvia and George are great, but during it, Sylvia says, I wrote my PhD in Lukács. I'm like, no, I had no idea. And I've read her PhD now. I haven't like super read it like closely, but it's quite interesting in that like one of the things I find quite paradoxical is she's writing a PhD in what, SUNY Buffalo in sort of early 70s to late 70s, which is the same time that she's involved in organizing wages for housework, right? But there is not a single mention of that in her PhD. Which is quite
interesting. That's very interesting. I think this is all. I mean, I guess a typical example of a work done while you are a political activist, so you don't have time to write a PhD, and what should last gone for three years goes on for 8-9 years. And I think she started off in 1972 or something like that when she started. We actually wrote an interesting article on Lukács in 1972. And I think that was the end, actually, of a sort of Lukács renaissance in Western Marxism. And so her work was timely. But then when she finished a PhD, it was, I guess, the early 80s. So a completely different panorama. And the absence of feminism is interesting, as you pointed out, but at the same time, I think it makes everything even more intriguing because that feminism is everywhere while she's writing that PhD in her mind, in her life, and so it's interesting to see, for example, how to kind of see some analogies between her use of images in her books and a reading of Lukács as someone who does not use images. This is what I'm trying to say, and I guess is her PhD seems to be detached from her political work, but in fact, it's not. It's indirectly present up until Caliban and the Witch, I think.
I think you could find some overlaps conceptually between her political work and the PhD. For instance, in her critique of realism and how you can't use concepts of realism in a Marxist sense unproblematically. And the way she basically takes Lukács to task for basically taking a lot of pre-Marxist concepts and smuggling them into his Marxist aesthetics.
Yeah.
And in a way, she ends up making a quite similar argument, I think, to what we started with, is the idea that I don't think when you read Sylvia's PhD, you can end up with sort of a Marxist feminist aesthetic at all. You could end up with
absolutely.
You could end up with a critique of Marxist aesthetics.
Absolutely. In fact, she starts off in the introduction by quoting Contropiano. So Tafuri, Azarosa, Cacciari were reading Lukács. And I think this is a link that some scholars might miss, because Contropiano is famous only within Italy, I guess. But there's a really interesting connection between Operaismo, Lukács, and Federici. And even Counterplan from the Kitchen is, in my view, a quotation. Is Contropiano. Contropiano means counterplan. The famous brochure. So there's a dialogue that is not always apparent, but there is one.
I suppose that's what makes projects like your book super interesting, in that oftentimes the dialogues and the references aren't explicit, but they're more of just like a shared set of ideas floating in the atmosphere that they get borrowed from here to here and aren't necessarily formally noted. Like Sylvia doesn't directly necessarily quote that in the title, but yeah, I can see your point that connects. What was the question is how you sort of trace out those different kinds of connections and what they did for people. To take one small one that I actually quite like, although I suspect you might be overreading a little bit here, is you're talking about classe operaia, and you're talking about the typography, which I really like, because people don't usually go into like talking about typography and spacing and like tons of like very small details. But you're talking about the typography and the fonts they were using. I think they were using, was it Bodoni?
Well, Quaderni Rossi used Baskerville and classe operaia Bodoni, but of course, I'm like you. I don't look at. I mean, unless you're a designer or a typographist, for an art historian, typography, unfortunately, it doesn't look very interesting. I think that's a mistake. But anyway, Alquati said in an interview, well, we decided to use Baskerville for Quaderni Rossi because that embodied a whole political strategy, full stop. So I wondered, what do you mean by that? So I had to find out about, what this kind of font might convey for an operaista. And maybe you're right, maybe I overread a bit, but I think there was explicitly, a meditation on typography.
Did you find out how Baskerville's was an entire political strategy?
Alquati died long ago, and so my interpretation was that Baskerville is an extremely elegant classical font, and so it was quite at odds with the actual content of the magazine of Quaderni Rossi, because it was only about factories, workers, the new working class, trade unions. So not the kind of topics you associate with a classical font, not, high literature. So I think there was an attempt to contradict, as I said, a sort of aesthetic, a 1950s aesthetic of struggles, a kind of realist, rather pedantic, formulaic vision of the struggles as something, rough, heavy. Baskerville is a very elegant, almost snobbish font. I think that kind of friction was productive.
So it's almost like using, let's say, a certain feel of a kind of classicism of let's say, imagine sort of like epic Greek statues, but to depict, but to talk about sort of the rude pagan race of the workers and the revolts. So that just, again, more of the disjunction.
And in fact, I wanted to add a kind of anecdote. When I talked about my topic with a colleague in Venice, who was in Florence in the early 70s, and this colleague is he retired, but is an expert on design and fashion. So, well, I thought, it's unlikely that it will find my book interesting. And I said, yeah, look at Operaismo and connections with aesthetics. And he said, well, there was the operaisti, so not Operaismo, had an aesthetic. And they were extremely smart and well-dressed in the early 70s. I don't know whether this is true, but I think at least they were well-dressed and smart compared to mainstream far leftists. I think that's the kind of, that was struck him as elegant. So I think that kind of connects with the idea of Baskerville. So communism has got nothing to do with, the dark and the dark life of factories, and it can be elegant, it can be smart, and it should be smart, perhaps.
Interesting. I don't think I personally would have thought of early Operaismo as being particularly stylish, and that's in part because I think early Operaismo, my instant thought is Tony's haircut, which is, I used to think it was kind of an atrocity. Sorry, Tony. Well, that's interesting. So but maybe just in a certain way, it's not as as impressive, but I mean, you could think of this similar ways. For instance, in the U.S., the Black Panthers had a very particular aesthetic to the way they dressed and how that was important to them. I'm not sure if it works the same way, but how that kind of, how that functions.
I think you have a point. There are differences, but also similarities. I think you're right. I mean, the Panthers, of course, were much more into this kind of self-fashioning. I think operaistas were not so pronounced in their interest, but there is a I guess a shared intent. Yeah.
I suppose then again, also the question is sort of what that then does in terms of when you're organizing, for instance, what effect it had to people who were then encountering this in the 70s, what impression they gave and how that affected them. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, that's interesting. But I'm also thinking about, so if Baskerville is for classe operaia, then which one uses Bodoni?
Classe operaia.
So
again, a very classical font, very elegant, almost neoclassical in a way. It's an 18th century font.
Okay. Interesting.
With the what's the word, the serif, the decorative things at the bottom of the letters.
Do you think that also informed the kind of, I know this is an official culture question, but informed like the writing style? Because
of course, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the past few years, I think the writing style of Marx has been reassessed as something important for his work, and I think the writing style of Tronti, of Negri, is very distinctive, of Bologna. And Tronti's writing style was extremely well calibrated. I think these sentences, that became slogan. I mean, it's not accident that some of his sentences became slogans. I think he wrote in a manner that facilitated this transition. This very simple, strong sentences, often made of principal sentences. They were not slogan yet, but they were, easy to turn into slogans or to turn into very memorable sentences. So I think, yeah, absolutely, this is something, I guess, also that we have to learn from. I mean, sometimes, Marxist jargon can be extremely complicated and rather esoteric. I think Tronti found a way to simplify some complex ideas.
I suppose in some ways the writing style also becomes part of an aesthetic, in the sense that with classe operaia you have the text beginning on the outside of the publication, not inside, which is an interesting choice. And I don't think that happens very often. Do you know why they chose to do that?
Again, Quaderni Rossi, doesn't have a cover. Again, I think I talked to some graphic designers because I fear that I might overinterpret this choice. And they said, oh, well, this is clearly a political choice. I don't know whether this is true, but according to some, let's say, professionals, well, the idea was to kind of prevent a sort of mediation. The cover as a kind of mediatory stage between the reader and the actual content of a book or a magazine. if you don't have that, if the content, the first article begins on the cover, it's in your face, there's no mediation, there's no kind of framework. And I think, again, it might be a bit of a stretch, but I think you can see that as something operaista, something that, you know, the kind of the direct expression, something fresh as well. I mean, maybe it's something, you know, that wants to be fresh, that wants to be provocative, and the absence of a cover suggests that.
Well, I think this goes back to what we were talking about before, in the sense that back to the idea about not having an aesthetic of representation. Is you're trying to get rid of that representation, you're going directly into the text, directly into the information or moment right there at the beginning, and there's no sort of like nice cover illustration or sort of, you know. That's interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
It also reminds me a bit of that part where Tronti quotes Clay, where he says that the job of art is not to reproduce the visible, but to make visible. So rather than, let's say, reproducing a moment of struggle visually, it's the text as just starting that way just goes right into making visible the struggle through the text.
And I think that quote from Baruchello is also interesting because this is it goes in the opposite direction. I mean, in my book, I tend to look at Tronti and to look at how some artists actually appropriated some of his ideas. And this is something that goes the other way around, because you can also say, well, what Tronti tries to do is to make it visible. In other words, not to provide objective sociological description of the struggles, but rather to find also the appropriate images to make visible the conflictual dimension of the working class. Even like think of a concept like worker passivity as a way of non-collaboration, as an expression of non-collaboration with management. This is, of course, a very risky idea, but still, this is a way to make it visible. Non-collaboration as a political decision.
Yeah, so it's the dynamic is there before. It's how you give it a form that is understood or can be understood.
Yeah,
that's interesting. One thing you talk about in terms of about artists who are working very quite directly with early operaistic folks, and this is something you also talk about in your previous book. I'm kind of blanking the title now. Individuals against individualism.
Individualism, yes.
Is the working relationship between the N group and operaistic folks, which if I understand correctly, also included sharing an office for several years, or
yeah. They shared the same. I mean, their studio was also the office of classe operaia in Padua for about 2 years, 1 year and a half. Yeah. So yeah, you know, that was a fascinating discovery when I did it, like more than 10 years ago now, because the N group was and still is often framed as an optical art group, which is, of course, a correct perspective. But on the other hand, the group was also part and parcel of classe operaia. The group the N group's texts were also informed by this, by a Marxist vision of art history, of art labor, neo-capitalism. And my colleagues tended to kind of avoid looking at this component of these aspects. So, well, I thought, well, we need to kind of rewrite the history of this group in light of its connection with Operaismo, which were not only biographical, which were not only, okay, we share the same space towards the dialogue,
I suppose part of the project that it is when you find those moments and sort of writing those stories back into it, because I guess I'd be curious about your colleagues who didn't want to focus on those aspects. Why not? Like why would you want to remove that connection from the sort of understanding, the end group or understanding Operaismo? It's quite an odd choice, but
well, I think I don't know why I guess it has to do with the art history's tendency to emphasize the visual dimension of artworks, whereas especially from the 60s onwards, you cannot just only focus on the works. You need to look at the context, the discursive context, the artists and art critics and curators and institutions elaborate and develop. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So I think there was a tendency to focus on that dimension, but this is a very partial approach.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm thinking is that particularly when you get into looking at forms of art that are more process-based, that the relationships and working relationships in particular that shape that process become all the more important rather than less important.
Absolutely. And the process is entirely political because, for example, the N group also wanted to abolish individual signature. And this was charged with political views, but also ethical views. On top of it, there was also a kind of scientific discourse that they wanted to embrace. In any case, the idea was to negate, and they said it very explicitly, the cult of personality, typical of the art world. And then, so of course, the phrase against the cult of personality is the phrase of the de-Stalinization movement. The refusal of the cult of personality that Stalin seemingly demanded. And so, that kind of quote basically opens up, entirely new terrain, because you need to explore why they kind of equated artists and dictators.
Yeah, one thing you also point out here is they're trying to get away from the role or the idea of the artist, maybe because of the quoting with dictators. But you talk a little bit about sort of the difference between how the N group think about artists versus talking about themselves as experimental designers, and how does experimental design exit the problem of the cult of the artist or the art figure?
Yeah, it's interesting because Italy, I guess, experimental design sounds like they wanted to exit the art world, but without really exiting it. The whole history of the group was a kind of very contradictory attempt to refuse some ideas while at the same time trying to remain within the art world as a space of freedom, as a space of, where people like artists and like designers back then could, express themselves on a variety of topics. So I think this is also something I try to do with my book. I think, you can't really ditch the idea of artists or the notion of art as something ideological, because these are also spaces that can provide, a very interesting creative forms of dialogue, where individuals who have very little power, like most artists, can nonetheless express themselves on a variety of topics, on a variety of issues. And this kind of metaphorical dimension of art is something we need to protect, not to glorify, not to kind of overestimate, but I think it's something that has, it's double-edged. And I think this is also the contradiction of the young group. So they don't want to be the narcissistic artists, of course, but they also want to express themselves on a variety of topics. And they know that because art has this metaphoric power, an art group that rejects individual signatures is a political statement, at least in the early 60s. And I think this is a power that artists want and still want, I guess, to preserve.
So I suppose it's on one hand wanting to exit the art world, but not totally leave it, or to use it strategically as a space to work from. In the same way that someone like, let's say, Sergio Bologna probably wanted to exit the literary world, but also kept working as a translator because that was useful as well.
Of course.
I guess it's kind of sort of maintaining a relationship with that world, even as you are taking certain functions of it. Which I guess sort of sounds a lot like a phrase that's used a lot in relation to operating concepts, which the idea of being within and against something rather than exiting it. So rather than saying, okay, we're going to just exit the art world, we're actually going to find some tools or methods here that can be used and use them otherwise.
This is a key idea, and regardless of its origin, I think, which was very much related to the Communist Party, within and against the Communist Party. But again, I think it's a key phrase that means it's not about exiting the system. It's not about, as an artist or as an activist that quits the city to live in the countryside, like many people, of course, in the 60s and 70s, and today, of course. It's not about exiting the system or claiming identity, a working class identity, as something alien to the system that has its autonomy, but rather to be within and against. And this is, I guess, also from a philosophical perspective, extremely interesting and quite original. I mean, not that they were the first to say that, of course, but I think within the tradition of Marxism, there's often been the tendency to kind of think of, let's say, a working class identity as something fundamentally alien to capitalism, that is against capitalism, as if it was something outside of it. And Tronti puts it very simply, says, well, the working class is capital. So this is within and against. The working class is variable capital, so it's within and against. And this is also has consequences in the artistic field. So you need to be part of the art world to be against it. In a way, you need to deal with a certain imaginary to oppose it. And going back to what I said earlier on, so this is the strategy of exacerbation. It's a strategy that allows you to visualize, to kind of to be within and against it. And the against it is precisely this process of this kind of dystopian visions that you produce.
I suppose that almost in a way that follows logically from the idea that once society has become subsumed by capital, of course you're with it again, because what else could there be? Once you sort of bought the idea of real subsumption, that kind of is the only logical position to work from, is that you're already inside capital. Yeah,
and cultural and capitalist culture. But if you think of the 60s, think of the Frankfurt School, for example, where people like Adorno had a completely different idea of what to do with the culture industry. And I think this is something. I mean, Operaismo functions in a completely different way. And architects like Archizoom say very clearly, I mean, the only terrain we deem, politically interesting is that of capitalist culture.
I suppose in a way it's kind of a rejoinder to, let's call it like the lazy meme rejection of anything of left politics, is to say, oh, you're against this thing, but you're also a part of it. Ha ha ha. Doesn't that compromise you? And saying, well, no, of course I'm a part of it. That doesn't mean I can't have, another perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, and this kind of argument is, of course, an often very moralistic argument, to which some you can always say, I mean, I mean, I guess that's the point. So of course you're part of it, and you cannot choose, who you work for example.
But I suppose in a way you could also say that could be the basis for making an argument for a certain kind of political importance, in the sense of, if you're saying it's only because I'm a part of it that I can effectively sabotage or intervene. So, for instance, maybe this is part of why you and this is, I think, one of the themes of your book I quite find interesting, is the importance of design and more design-based activities. And my guess here is that part of that turn is because if the idea of the artist is still associated with the kind of romantic outside to capitalism, like the genius artist working in their garret or whatever, right? If you have this idea that sort of artistic labor is thought of as being outside of capital, which is not, then clearly design labor is always inside, because it's something quite different. It's always functionalized from the beginning.
Yeah, I think, you have a point. I think that difference between design and art is perhaps related to these stereotypes. The artist is outside, the designer is inherently inside, whereas, this is not really the case. And I think a designer has this, a space of agency within his or her work, and I think also I tried to kind of point out that some designers who adhere to Operaismo, try to kind of develop struggles that were in that direction, that basically try to trade unionize designers, to kind of show, and also on top of it, to carry out research that should show designers that they were part of the capitalist system. They were not independent professionals, even if they were independent, from a contractual perspective. And I think this is extremely interesting and important today, where this kind of idea of, freelance journalists or designers, whatever, suggests freedom.
It also gets to ideas you're taking from I'm gonna say his name wrong, Ferrari Bravo. We're talking about I'm gonna say this, I'm gonna mispronounce it, but this sort of the idea of progetto, and how it's very difficult to translate all the sort of multiple meanings of it, and how that plays out.
Yeah, I think this is one of the richnesses of this term. For example, at the university where I work, the department is called Culture of Progetto, which means, and we have architects, we have designers, we have visual artists, we have urban planners, fashion designers. So what do they have in common? Perhaps not a lot, but I guess the idea is that they do have something in common. They have progetto in common. So the idea that you have to combine a theoretical perspective and a practical dimension, and the two things cannot be separated. which sounds a bit, obvious. And on the other hand, the idea, design, if you think of this word, progetto is often translated as design, and I think it's okay to a certain extent, as long as you remember that design, as in English, has two meanings, design as the design of a product, but also political designs, in other words, political intentions. And so I think this intentionality, this, is extremely important when you think of progetto. And I think it's an interesting idea that combines several dimensions and declare them as inseparable. So, for example, Ferrari Bravo said, well, designers should not forget that design is also the production process. You as designers should look into the production process and contribute to design that as well, not just the final part of a product, but how the product is shaped during the production, the manufacturing process, let's say. And I think this is an extremely interesting perspective. And some people like De Ganello tried to do that. And for example, he tried to discuss his projects with the people active within the factory that actually tried to translate his projects into reality. And sometimes, as we all know, it's very difficult to translate something on paper into a material shape, a material form. And he wanted to explore that metamorphosis. And so he kind of discussed with them and also transcribed their discussions and the conflicts and tensions between different professionals. But also, and I think this is more interesting perhaps today, the idea is that there's a continuum, that is the whole process is design. And you cannot separate the creator and the person, the technician, let's say, that tries to translate those ideas into reality, into a product.
I mean, one way to think about it is, and you're thinking about design as a process, is realizing that every user of an object or a system isn't going to necessarily follow what the intents were for how that should be used, right? There's a lot of, let's say, voluntary or involuntary misuse, which then reshapes any system or object. If you really wanted to stretch the idea of design further, you could say that the key understanding of key finding of Operaismo is realizing that the working class in struggle is constantly reshaping and redesigning capitalism. That's probably stretching it, right? But
well, I don't know. Maybe yes, if it's taken as a kind of transhistorical feature. But I think there are moments where this happens actually, and I think Fossil Capitalism by the book by Malm. I mean, in a way that the book proves that some technologies were adopted to contrast working class struggles. So I think, yeah, of course, there's a mutual, shaping of, and I think this happens. The mutual design, if you like, yeah.
Well, it reminds me of this argument that my friend Matteo Mandarini made before, which is the idea that sort of the function of working class rebellion is to bring new forms of intelligence or ideas, which are then sort of valorized by capital. And thus, when you get to a point in capitalist development where there is no longer antagonism, you're actually missing that. So you almost need to synthesize a moment of antagonism to find that.
I think, for example, this, I don't know to what extent that it's interesting to bring this up, but I think what happens in Italy now, for example, it's a good example of how the lack of struggles and the lack of political forces enabling these struggles hinder capitalism. The lack of working class struggles hinder the function of capitalism. Because at the moment in Italy, wages are so low that nobody wants to work anymore. And the demand and the offer don't meet. and this is, and nobody tries to kind of nobody. I mean, it's very difficult to raise the wages at the moment in Italy, because you don't have strong unions, strong parties, strong organizations, and capitalism doesn't work.
So it's almost like you need to bring that back in some aspect just to even get the functioning of the functioning of the capitalist system.
So I think there's absolutely, I think you have a point. I mean, there's a kind of mutual design of the forces that compete. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm also thinking about, and this is outside the scope of your book, but if you look at things about like the rise of organizing around precarity in the early 2000s, right? That you can trace that back to the work of groups like the Chain Workers Collective, who had people in who were working as designers and as translators. So you have a certain people who are working in certain kinds of labor, filling similar roles, trying to like revive a kind of or reorient a kind of political iconography. In that case, trying to sort of find a new set of symbols and ideas to represent sort of dealing with precarious work as opposed to previous work practices.
Yeah. I think the precarity of labor is a feature of labor that has a very long history, and I think it's actually the 30, 40 years after World War II that are the exception, where labor was more stable, more permanent, and I think this precarity is something that we need to work. We are within and against it, and I think this is something also very important. And it has a long history, and which is again something we need to kind of reassess, perhaps.
Yeah. I was also partially thinking about Bifo's description of a moment in late 70s Italy when precarity was regarded as a quite beautiful thing, because precarity meant exiting the factory, exiting sort of a deadly, boring rhythm of constant forwardist labor, for years and years and years.
Yes. Well, I guess, yeah, and of course, this was quite naive of them to kind of think, well, it's easy. You just need to work like many people did. You work in the factory for a couple of months, and then you go on a trip to India or to Sicily, and it's cool, Yes, but today, for example, we know how expensive houses have become, or even renting a place has become extremely expensive, and so this is something you need to take into consideration when you think, well, it's easy to quit the factory, and yeah, but the cost of life has changed significantly since the 70s. So I think it's difficult to kind of today to see precarity as a form of liberation, not because it's not, but because the cost of life has changed.
Well, it reminds me of this one section from We Want Everything by Balestrini, where there's I think it's early in the book when the protagonist is just starting to go to school, and he's sort of leaving his small village, and he all of a sudden realizes, like, okay, all these cool things in the city, and like I can go to dances and eat pizza. And his mom's like, oh, no, don't do that. Like, it's beneath you. And the dad's like, listen, son, here's the important thing. You don't want those things, not because they're not good, but because they require money. And money requires work, and work is bad. And the more you sort of invest your desires into things that require money, the more you have to work. And that's bad. And then he says, it's fun now, but you'll have a family, and you won't be working for like pizzas and dances. You'll be working for basically keep a roof over your head, and then it's not fun anymore. And to me, this is like the perfect father-son talk ever, but the best one ever. It's like, don't do it. It's work. It's horrible. It's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is something I don't deal with in my book, but I think there's a whole history of workers from the south moving to the north of Italy, and I think Operaismo is not really thinkable with this. Without this migration, which is also a cultural migration, and also, of course, there's a certain amount of projection into this, non-workerist south, or as if people in the south, share this vision of work as something bad. I mean, I guess this is, of course, partial, but I think this is part of the story. A new, culture of work.
I suppose you can make an interesting comparison there in terms of like thinking about how Negri corresponded with people from Detroit, and it was quite inspired by sort of working class rebellions happening, particularly in the automotive section, and a lot of the population that was involved in that was sort of Black workers who moved northwards from the south. So there's an interesting similarity there in terms of migrant populations who aren't integrated into existing political economic structures, who are angry at basically being screwed, and then developing new forms of cultural expression as a result of that.
I always remember on the first issue of Potere Operaio, the magazine, the last page, on the last page, there's a heading saying, the Black workers in Detroit are Marxist-Leninist. And I think this is a misreading, but I think it's also interesting how they've tried to kind of see similarities, analogies, and to build upon them, which is, I think, politically correct. I mean, otherwise, if you see differences rather than the similarities, well, it's very difficult to kind of build a common horizon.
Yeah, so maybe there's a certain value in seeing that similarity rather than seeing the difference and going, oh, actually, there is this. Well, I mean, there is sections of workers, for instance, in Drum, who, if not Marxist-Leninists, are certainly in the nearby vicinity. But then it's interesting, like when you get these moments in 77, when you get let's call it the sort of movement of counterculture into the factories. And this was, I think, perhaps the sort of moment where I literally started laughing when I was reading it in your book, where Negri's like, the moment we discovered that the workers smoked joints was nearly as important as discovering that working class rebellion shapes capital. Which is really funny because at one level it sounded like Tony doing a sort of like a, hello, fellow kids, I too am one of you.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It tells you quite a lot about Negri's expectations as well. I mean, I think, Negri is born, I think, 1933. So it was a man who, despite his willingness to see the new working class, still, had a different, image of the working class. And I think it was deeply shocking for him to realize that the working class smoked joint on the assembly line. I think, yeah, and this is great. On the other hand, I think it's great that he tries to think this through, to take it seriously.
I guess what I find most fascinating about that period is that seems to be a moment where, I guess you'd say, ideas and tactics or approaches borrowed from avant-gardes become much more massified. You get the sort of, you get the rise of like Radio Lice, you get the sort of, you get A Traverso, you get these sort of things which were maybe before done in small galleries, but are now done on like a pop culture scale.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that still has to be examined, I think, especially when you look at the history of the avant-gardes and new avant-gardes. But there's a missing chapter, and this is what happens in this. I guess not only in Italy in the 70s, where the new avant-gardes are rediscovered not by specialists, but by young people and sometimes people without university backgrounds and so on. And I think this mixture, this clash is extremely interesting. How Dada becomes punk. This is something that has been a bit discussed, but other kind of lines can be drawn, I think. And I think this 77 movement in Italy is a very good example of that.
But it's interesting that you see some similar things happening elsewhere. So, for example, I'm thinking of Ben Maria with Black Mask up against the wall, saying that the legitimate inheritors of Dada are street delinquents rather than artists. Yeah, I get to see those.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I made the encounter between Ben Maria and Pablo Sharon possible. They met in Rome. And it was great to see how they kind of realized that they had done something similar to a certain extent in the 60s and 70s. And both, interestingly enough, worked with monsters. The figure of the monster is also a leitmotif of this kind of attempt to visualize new forces, new beings, new creatures, new subjectivities. And I think this is, again, something that deserves attention.
It's always fun to talk about monsters, so that would be that could definitely be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just go back to Negri for a second, and this is sort of kind of a tangent. I don't know if you know about this, maybe you don't, but a while ago I was looking into the overlap of far left politics in Italy in the 70s and football, in part because I was working on publishing the translation of Paulo Soyer's book, because he was in Avanguardia Operaia and was also playing for Perugia. But one thing I came across, and I think this was on Italian Wikipedia, that Negri was a sort of, and I guess still is, a big fan of AC Milan. And it was claimed that he was like the founder of like the AC Milan Ultras group, which was...
Well, I don't know about that. I don't think so, to be honest. But there's a strong tradition of politicized ultras in Italy, which is dying down, unfortunately. But in the 80s, in fact, Balestrini also wrote a book called I Fanatici, the Fanatics, well, because fanatics is the same word, which is about this kind of social context. And I think it's extremely interesting how some, for example, the football fans of AC Milan are still called black and red brigades because of the colors of the AC Milan. And I think, I mean, I don't know about that, but I guess this has to be traced back to the late 70s, early 80s, when football became, I mean, being a fan, became something different. And politics, or, far left politics was dying down, and still the echoes of it still, inform the imagination of young people. We're no longer, far left activists, but we're still fascinated by the deeds of these people. So they kind of still use some words, still use some images.
Well, I was wondering if indeed Negri was one of the founders of the AC Milan Ultras, that the idea that maybe he was actually, part of the Red and Black Brigades, and maybe
maybe.
and maybe that fed into the accusation. It's like, we found it.
This is. I think Balestrini, as is often the case in his life, he actually captured something, a historical transition in the 80s with this book.
Well, another thing I came across which I found quite interesting is I'm blanking on the name. Important psychologists, psychiatrists to help close down asylums.
Basaglia.
Yeah. When I was reading about Italian ultras in the 70s, I came across the idea that after the Basaglia laws passed in 79 or 80, that one of the sort of groups that became a de facto support group for people leaving the asylums was football ultra groups.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So you have this maybe sort of like, and in some ways you could make interesting comparisons between, let's say, football club fan groups and the art world, where it's something where it's like social relationships are generated in that space, which then maybe move on to elsewhere, or maybe they don't. Maybe they serve a different function.
There's, I guess, also an issue of masculinity, that plays out in one way or another. In among fans, about militants, it's also, being a man, becoming a man, and homosexuality, as a way to kind of mediate, forms of homoerotism, perhaps.
Well, I suppose then you can get the idea about certain kinds of conflicts between ultras are not actually intended to be violent, but are more kind of like over-the-top theater, where the conflict is part of this weird ritual process.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. The theatrical dimension of it, also of activism, unfortunately, is very strong.
Not always a bad thing, but in a bit strange. But one other thing I want to ask you about: Bifo prank calling the prime minister, because he can do a very good, was it a vocal impersonation?
This is true. Yeah, you could impersonate the second most important person at Fiat, the brother of the main owner, let's say that. And so basically he phoned the office of the prime minister, pretending to be the brother of Agnelli, so the main owner of Fiat, and a secretary just put him through, and Radio Alice broadcasted this quite surreal conversation between a fake capitalist, Bifo, impersonating Agnelli, and the Prime Minister, Andreotti, a very powerful Christian Democrat. But interestingly enough, nothing happened. So the Prime Minister said, well, because I guess the conversation went on about factory struggles and how will they stop? How will they stop this, mean workers? I'm sick of it. And the Prime Minister basically said, well, it's complicated. It's complicated. And so on and so forth. So basically, it didn't say much. And until he realized that it was just a joke. Is
there a recording of this?
I don't think so, because there's virtually nothing left of what Alice broadcasted. But there's a film about Radio Alice, and this kind of scam call is reenacted.
Oh, okay, cool. I suppose I should look for that.
Yeah.
We'll probably maybe get towards coming into a conclusion, since we've been going for about an hour. But maybe as a thought to sort of maybe to end with is sort of, when you're looking, you have all these histories of sort of overlapping of different kinds of artistic cultural practices, different kinds of political ideas emerging, from the 60s to the 80s. Maybe I should ask you sort of it's harsh to ask this, given that this book is almost kind of encyclopedic in its kind of depth of things. But what are the things you think could use more looking into or be explored more, that like, oh, I wanted to do a bit more on that, but I was already at 500 pages and I didn't want to
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess there are many topics that still deserve to be explored, and I think one of them is the south of Italy, which is often a bit left out by these narratives that take place between the north, the big factories in the north, Rome because it's the capital. But the south of Italy is very interesting in terms of rebellions, in terms of imaginary, in terms of people moving from the south to the north, and also bringing, as you partly said, a different idea of work, a different idea of labor as a burden, as something negative. I mean, of course, we need to be very careful because we should not generalize, but still, I think this kind of gap existed. And I think, politics in the South, politics, with day laborers, I think this is something, and also the kind of, it's sort of Orientalism, which is not Oriental, but like a slightly Orientalist vision of the South that some operisti had, but also operisti that actually came from the South, like Piperno, one of the main leaders of Potere Operaio, comes from Calabria. And this is always very present in his life, his work, and his identity. I think this is something that could be explored. Yeah.
I suppose I take your point about not wanting to generalize, and for instance, in the UK, you get this whole discussion about oh, those people who are just slacking off and, that aren't working hard enough. But I think that in a way is almost part of the appeal of these ideas. That's where you get your Gasparazzo figure, your Andy Capp figure, who just doesn't want to work hard because working hard is a bit crap. And I think it almost is kind of appealing and very relatable in the sense that, like, maximization of productivity it isn't. So it's also interesting thinking about the South, the way then you have people like Mario Rosa della Costa and Silvia Federici. Silvia then moves to Nigeria for 3 years. Mario Rosa starts looking more at let's call it the development politics, and sort of almost looks more at agriculture and fishing. So it's almost a return to looking at those kinds of laboring activities that are, I won't say of the South, but more of the South than factory work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think today it's a very interesting perspective. The South. What is the South? This is the global South. Of course, it's not a geographical South. It could be within a metropolis in the north. And so I think today we have the kind of tools to understand that kind of interesting exchange of ideas, imaginaries, and stereotypes as well.
Cool. Yeah, because stereotypes always express a kernel of truth within something else. But yeah, cool. Okay, well, maybe we'll leave it off there. I'll just thank you for coming along.
Thank you, Steve.